Right. So in this session, we are to talk about plot and subplot points in screenplay. We have already discussed about the three-act screenplay structure and the plot structure in screenplay. So I'm going to talk about plot points and what are the important roles plot points play and subplot points play in screenplays. Let's look at it. So what is a story plot? It's kind of recalibrating what we have discussed earlier. So story plot refers to the main events in a story composed as a connected sequence of events. Okay, so plot is largely series of sequences of events interconnected with each other. It can be made up of several seemingly unconnected threads, but as long as they are presented in a way that communicates to the viewer that these actions and events are connected in some way, you may safely refer to the chain of events as a plot. Okay. So one is there has to be a logical coherent connection between them, and they must justify each other's presence. Okay, and there must be some sort of a narrative progression. That's what largely a story plot refers to. What makes a good plot? First one is it explains the chain of events in a story. It shows a causal relationship between each event. Each event that you are dramatizing and writing in your screenplay must have some sort of a causal relationship with one another. Why this sequence is there and why the sequence is important in this act and why that sequence is important in that act and how they're interconnected. Those things will eventually come up once you start writing or developing. Those are the plot points. Then connects the action and events in a logical manner. Like I told you, there must be some sort of a logic behind why you are writing this thing or why you think that this particular event or action is going to play a significant role in the narrative going forward. A great plot is built around logic. Okay. Screenplay writing itself is logical in nature. What you are doing is you are trying to apply logic to the world of storytelling and coming up with characters and bringing in actions and events in their lives, um, which is based around logic or which should be based around logic somewhere. This means that something happens and there is a consequence. So they're going to take some sort of a decision and there has to be some kind of a consequence to that decision. Whether that consequence is morally acceptable or fair is up to the writer. That depends on what kind of a space you are coming from, how freely do you write, what are the things you write about, how far you can push yourself in terms of writing, in terms of presentation. But the connection between the two events is crucial. Whatever two events you're putting forward, those events are crucial. That's how we as viewers know that what we see matters. And we are now on a narrative roller coaster. Plot can thus be defined as the sequence of events in a story in which we track a character's pursuit of a goal or objective. And a plot point is an event that changes the character's orientation to that objective. It's that part which is significant, the plot point, that it could come in terms of an event or an occasion that would change the character's orientation, approach to the goal or ambition or the objective he or she is pursuing. At each plot point or plot juncture, the character is either closer or farther from that objective. Remember, you begin in the act one with that objective by introducing the audiences or the readers to that objective. And with the movement of each plot point, the protagonist or the character is either coming close to that objective or moving away. So in that way, the plot point marks progress and propels the story forward. Okay, it's that crest and trough that makes the journey interesting, both from the character's point of view as well as from the audience's or the viewer's point of view. So the major plot point works together to create a spine for the story. So that gives us something that we call as the structure. Whitfield, in his seminal book Screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting, discusses, quote, the first plot point occurs 30 minutes into a film, assuming that a standard film is 120 minutes of running time, and the second one occurs 80 to 90 minutes into the film. Remember, 20 to 30 minutes, you are supposed to introduce the first plot point. In the 80th to 90th minute into your story or your screenplay or your film, the second plot point must come in. Generally, The first plot point ends at Act 1 and propels the story into Act 2. Likewise, the second plot point ends at Act 2 and propels the story into Act 3. So it comes at those two junctures. What are the major plot points? There are probably there are probably few people who debate what's considered a major plot point, but likely the lineup could be this, must appear like this. First one is called the catalyst, second is breaking into Act 2, third is the midpoint, fourth is the low point, fifth is breaking into Act 3, then the final battle. So this is how major plot point movements happen. And this is what strings together and gives you a bigger picture of your story. These plot points show up in most successful movies. Okay, by successful, I want to say that the stories that have worked, not just the box office successes, or those people of which films which are commercially successful. A successful film which has got a recall value, films that are popular films that you go back to. Remember that these are the plot points that are introduced in those narratives. Effective movies create a desired emotional effect on the viewer. We have been discussing over a period of time as to why your primary role as a screenwriter is to elicit some sort of emotional drive, emotional impact from the viewers. The setup and the delivery of that effect is created with careful orchestration of the story elements. What are the story elements? These plots, screenplay devices are the story elements that help us understand what the narrative is, including the plot points. Often that orchestration takes a certain shape and pattern, one that is shared by other effective stories. So when you are comparing multiple stories, you can see, okay, these are the plot points, and this is exactly coming at the first 30th minute, or the 88th minute or 78th minute, and here it is coming at 28th minute, coming at 68th minute. So when you start analyzing the screenplays, you'll know where the plot points are, where the screenplay writer is breaking into the plot points, and how introduction of those plot points and the gradual movement from a certain plot point to another one is helping us build stories which carry a certain shape and pattern, which is successful in nature. Some stories do take a formulaic approach to, mainstream standard films do follow this kind of formulaic approach. They design plot points for spectacle, mistaking the size of the event for quality. And this is where, the formulaic approach fails because these stories miss the point. It's never about the size, it's about the effect. Okay. You can't win over the audience just by mere scalability of a project. So it has to drive them emotionally. So everything that you're writing has to have that potential effect or impact on them, not give them just the grandeur. To get the desired effect, you have to know the purpose of a given plot point and then design it to fulfill that function in your particular story. So the major role plot points play is to fulfill these functions in the story or to take the narrative forward. The major plot points below may show up in most stories, but that doesn't mean that there are not expectations to the rules. If you need to do it differently to get the effect you want, then go for it. Okay, but be deliberate about the effect you are creating within the story. So if you are breaking any kind of a norms, you don't want to follow this kind of a structure. Then whatever structure you are recreating or borrowing from, understand what kind of a larger impact it is going to have in your story. And then if that kind of a logical application makes sense, you proceed accordingly. Catalyst, also known as the inciting incident. Jennifer, can you please mute yourself? I'm recording the session. Thank you. Catalyst, also known as the inciting incident, it occurs 10 to 15 pages into the script. Told you that this is where the plot point one is introduced right in the first act, which is also known as the inciting incident. You might think of it as the event that sets the story into motion. or that shakes up the protagonist's normal world. Remember, you are introduced to the normal world and they are going to move away from that normal world. So in that process of moving away from the normal world, there must be one event that would occur that would shake their world, and they would bring in that sort of change or novelty in their life. And this is where, which is called as the catalyst plot point. It is often the first appearance or indication of an antagonist or the main force of opposition. Okay, you know that now you're slowly going to get introduced to the obstacle or the conflict. So the catalyst function in the story is to kick off a problem or opportunity that the protagonist must act upon. So the call for action in the narrative. Break into Act 2, also known as plot point 1, if you're a Sitfield fan, occurs at the end of the first act. So right when you're breaking into the Act 2, plot point 1 is introduced. Often described as the event that locks the protagonist into the story or forces him to begin to pursue the story's goal in earnest. Okay, with some sort of an earnestly, he or she is going to pursue the story's goal. It launches the story into Act 2 by solidifying what the protagonist is going to pursue over the course of the story, which is basically the objective of the story, and showing us that he or she is starting that pursuit now. Okay, so right in that stage, in the introduction of Act 2, you would see that protagonists have already identified what their objective is and have decided that they are going to move forward. This gives the audience something to track upon. Okay, it's the journey, then they have started riding on the journey. It helps us engage with your story because it allows us to follow the progress towards the goal, whatever be their goal is. Next point is called the midpoint, often described as the major raising of the stakes or turning the story into a new direction. Okay, the stakes goes higher, remember that. You probably notice the midpoint turns in movies without realizing it. After the midpoint, effective stories usually feel more intense, faster paced, more urgent, or with higher stakes. Sometimes the midpoint is a reveal. It's a big reveal for the audience or the main character. Sometimes it's the launching of a time clock. It can be a huge defeat or a huge win. So it's that point where the story can go forward positively for the protagonist, or it can create a failure. Whatever it is, it launches some sort of more intense moment for the protagonist as well as the audiences. Its function is to create a new tension. It causes the audiences to lean in, to get even more invested, to make them eager to stick around for the rest of the story. So this, you are dropping the anticipation bomb that, oh man, now what is going to happen? How they are going to decide that whether they should proceed or kind of retreat back. From midpoint, you move to the low point, also known as the All the Lost Dark Night of Soul story beats. Okay, something that I was talking about in the last session. Often described as the point where protagonist seems furthest from reaching his or her goal. Okay, it might be where the protagonist loses his or her support system, such as if a main character dies, the love interest leaves, or the hero is fired from his position of responsibility or authority. This is a place in the story where the character usually realizes what he or she must learn and change going forward. Because if you are not trying to work upon these kind of changes, if you're not realizing that there is a transformatory moment that is awaited and you must decide accordingly, then it's less likely that your protagonist is going to win over. The protagonist is going to resolve that conflict. We often see the theme reflected back to the protagonist here, is that point of self-realization, which kind of makes sense since the theme is related to the lesson of the character, lesson the character needs to learn. Okay, remember you are introduced the characters with a certain kind of a dramatic question, and the character has to, through his actions and events, insecurities, winning over those insecurities, battling physical as well as internal conflicts must show us or take us in the journey. And in the journey, the one thing that is recurrent is the theme, which was introduced right in the beginning, and the dramatic question. And it's their job, it's the protagonist's job to offer answer to that. So they are at this point, at the point of, at the low point, the point of no return, they are reintroduced to what was the reason why they took this call at the first place. If the character is going to be changed by the events of the story, then this is the point. There is nowhere else to go, or the point of no return is what I call it. Here, he or she has been through the ringer, seemingly to no avail, and is out of options. So he is finally stopping to avoid. Uh, So he will finally stop avoiding the hard lesson and begin embracing that new life of strategy. So they are re-strategizing, retreating, and coming up with a more transformatory worldview and an action plan. This is where you break into the Act 3, also known as the plot point 2. Okay, remember, right before the beginning of the Act 3, the second plot point has to be introduced, which is basically page 80th to 90th minute, or 80th to 90th page of your screenplay. After the realization of the movement of low point, the protagonist knows what he or she must do. A new plan is formulated in order to achieve that story's goal. That plan, however nascent, far-fetched, or dangerous, will be the final attempt to achieve the story's goal. It gives us, the audience, something to track over for the rest of the meal. This is what we will be watching in Act 3. As you can guess, the function of this plot point is to propel us into Act 3, into the protagonist's preparation or initial efforts to that final journey. Okay, the last point being called the final battle, also known as the climax. The climax is the main character's final confrontation with the primary obstacle. What is the primary obstacle? It's the antagonist's journey as well, remember. So he or she is going to face the antagonist. And this is the climax, is the preparation for that final confrontation with the primary obstacles. This is where he or she is going to find the dramatic answer to the question that was raised in the first segment of the first act. This is the battle that determines the outcome of a war. Once and for all, there will be no more chances. The goal will be achieved or not. It depends on whatever would be the goal that you are introducing the audiences. The audiences will know the answer to the dramatic question. Will the protagonist attain the goal? Is something that they're constantly anticipating about. This is where we get the answer, yes or no. Once the dramatic question is answered, the movie is essentially over. Okay, this is climax is something that brings resolution to the story. And if you're working out of your story, keep in mind that you do not have to discover these plot points in a chronological order. Okay, it might sound all very overwhelming that okay, then how do we mechanically structure these things in our mind while developing? When you are writing, you write. You don't think about other things. You start developing only, after writing for a certain period of time, you realize that, okay, where is this story progressing? Then these questions will start coming inside your mind, and then you would probably start proceed to plot point 1, plot point 2, the kind of structures. So the discovery of plot points in a chronological order might or might not happen, and you are not bound to do so. Remember, you start with whatever you know, and then use that to help, use that material, whatever you have developed, to help you find others. Often you are developing an idea, you will have one or more of these plot points already in mind, okay, that how this is going to change the narrative. Maybe you know what the big climactic confrontation scene will be, and it's what inspires the whole movie. Like, I'll give you one example before we close. One film that I was writing, I began the film because one thing that I had was the climax sequence. I knew this is what the climax sequence is going to be. Though it is, remember, it's coming right at the end of the film. It's a 100-minute film, and it's probably coming at the 98th minute or 97th minute. That's the first thing that I had. I had the visuals of that. So I started writing from there, and then I started writing backward. So this is not a linear process. Linear process would come in, at the end of first draft that you've written. Then you can reshuffle your documents, you can reshuffle your pages, start placing the characters here and there, and see whether they are fitting the bill or not. You'll figure out. You have to do the maths, how to go forward, and remember that there is always a subconscious logic at work, and that's okay. Soon all of the puzzling pieces will fit together. You'll be able to see the entire big picture of your screenplay living in these 6 plot points, okay, that we spoke about. Um, and This is about plot points. Let's proceed to the subplot points. What is a subplot? A subplot is a secondary plot used in films and television that receives less screen time and emphasizes more on the main plot. Subplots may never intertwine with the story's main plot, but to be effective, they work to enhance the main plot of the film. So it's also called as a B plot. So B plots often have the same general components and plot structure as the main plot, but have fewer points and beats. Okay, so they work as again as a catalyst, or they work as a support system to your major plot points. What is the definition of a subplot in literature? Similarly, in literature, a subplot is a secondary plot that runs parallel to a story, its main plot, and supports it. Okay, so here our literature is the screenplay. So what is the subplot's function? What do? They add thematic depth. So remember, your film is also theme-based, and your subplots are going to add on nuggets of information which eventually raises the thematic depth of the film. It tests the film's protagonist. Okay, by introducing subplots, you are bringing in conflicts and resolutions at different points in the protagonist's journey. So there are testing moments or testing times in our lives, and there are testing moments and testing times in the protagonist's life as well. So these testing times could be reflected in the subplot elements. Then it reveals more character traits. Definitely, it allows even the secondary characters to contribute somewhere. So the subplot points add values to those character traits. Then it establishes different points of view. Okay, your narrative is not moving in a linear pattern where what you are offering to the audience is very dry. The moment different points of view emerge, layering happens, conflicts is introduced and reintroduced, and you work towards those things. So subplot points allows you to establish different point of views of different characters and see how the scenes are progressing in terms of the larger narrative progression. Okay, the various types of subplots. To start incorporating subplots into your film, it's important to first understand the types of subplots that exist by analyzing different subplots as examples. So we're going to look at two or three. The vehicle and the type of a subplot can vary based on the film's genre and plot structure. So depending on the plot structure, because that takes prevalence or that takes prominence, and what kind of film's genre you have picked up as material to write on. However, all of them as a primary role, they need to serve the main plot. Okay, so one type of subplot is adding a romantic B story. Okay, when we talk about romantic B story, means that is not the primary plot. It runs parallelly to the narrative. This is one of the most common used subplots, as it's quite easy to weave into a story's main plot or a film's main plot. The protagonist meets someone and begins a relationship while the main plot line is occurring. So the main plot line is revenge. If the protagonist wants to take revenge, then somewhere in the narrative they would be introduced to what would be called as a love interest. Okay, romantic subplots can create drama. They can create drama and empathy within the main plot line, as you'd witness in Christopher Nolan's movie Dark Knight. Dark Knight is an example where the romantic subplots serves a good purpose. Although this is not a part of the main plot of Batman Saving Gotham, Bruce Wayne's relationship with Rachel is important in humanizing our protagonist Bruce, as well as creating conflicts in his objective. There would be a moral dilemma at some point in time. So in order to add layers, add more values to what Batman is going to talk about, or Batman is thinking, or is going to do. It adds that added layer. This scene from Dark Knight weaves together this romantic B story into the main plot through the actions of the film's antagonist, the Joker, making for a highly dramatic scene. Okay, so when you're adding romantic B stories, by introducing subplots, you are bringing in more objectives into the protagonist as well as the antagonist's lives. So certain kind of a subplot add values in this way. Second is bring conflict to the B plot. Okay, creating conflict between characters or within a subplot can help add tension to your script, especially if it is a serious, more dramatic story. So more the drama, the merrier it is for the audiences, because they will have more material to chew on. The conflict of a subplot can also help reveal traits of your characters, of your story's character in the face of a controversy. So when you are confronted with a situation you are not expecting, how are you going to behave, act, react? So it's those action moments, those decision moments that come in the form of your subplots. In Good Will Hunting, for example, the main plot follows Will and his journey in becoming more open to the world as a genius opens up. The B plot follows the conflict between Sean, led by Robin Williams, and his old roommate, Professor Lumbaugh. So it's the conflict between Sean and Professor Lumbaugh that also gives a different trajectory into our understanding of the main plot. Then the next one is add a B story to the existing character arcs. Okay, so you have developed character arcs, then slowly try to introduce certain subplot elements into their lives and see how they're reacting or acting in those kind of situations. This type of subplots may have to do with emotional, spiritual, intellectual growth that occurs for a character, all to add values and layers to the character and to make it lot more meatier. Oftentimes, this can be a byproduct of or related to a character's main goals and contribute to the character's development of a protagonist. It could be a trait, it could be a physical trait, it could be a situation where which is not natural or organic is parallel. So what do they do in that kind of situation? The character development is one of the most in one of the most best movies of 2017, Lady Bird, which went on to win the Screenplay award, is cleverly illustrated by Lady Bird's disdain for her real name. At the end of the film, when she introduces herself as Christine, we see the completion of a character's arc and her acceptance of who she is. Because many a times we don't buy into that idea. So it's that self-realization, it's that point of self-realization, it's that point of acceptance that kind of brings some sort of an internal closure to the conflict that we might be avoiding for the longest period of time. So the subplots kind of help us do that and bringing in justice and resolution to the kind of conflict that you and me face in daily lives, and is something that also gets reflected in the screenplays that we develop or we write, and that's something that is extremely humanizing about sort of a literary material to go on to get transformed into movies. All right, so that's more or less what I wanted to talk about plot points and subplot points in screenplays and how do you introduce them at different junctures in your screenplay. Thank you.